In the summer of 2019, a trail camera mounted to a pine tree on the edge of Yellowstone National Park captured something that wildlife researchers would later describe, with careful scientific restraint, as unusual. A large male grizzly bear had located a whitebark pine stand loaded with cones. He was methodically stripping branches, working the food source with the focused efficiency of an animal that had done this thousands of times. Then, a black bear appeared at the edge of the frame. The black bear was a mature female, probably 4 years old, probably 200 pounds. She was not small for her species. She stopped when she saw the grizzly. She did not run immediately. She stood at the margin of the feeding area for what the timestamp indicates was approximately 40 seconds. Then, the grizzly turned and looked at her. The black bear left. She did not run. She walked, with the particular kind of deliberate, unhurried departure that behavioral ecologists recognize as the movement of an animal that has made a cost-benefit calculation and arrived at a clear answer. She was not panicked. She was informed. She left because she understood, at whatever level understanding operates in a bear's nervous system, exactly what she was looking at and exactly what the outcome would be if she stayed. That interaction, 40 seconds of footage from an unmanned camera in a pine forest in Wyoming, contains inside it the entire architecture of a biological relationship that has been playing out across North America for thousands of years. It contains the weight differential, the weaponry comparison, the territorial logic, the prey assessment, the behavioral history encoded in two species that have lived in overlapping ranges and competed for overlapping food sources for longer than our species has existed on this continent. It contains the answer to a question that people who spend time in bear country, researchers who study bear ecology, and wildlife managers who deal with the consequences of bear conflicts ask with genuine curiosity and genuine urgency. When a grizzly bear and a black bear want the same thing, who wins? And why does it happen with such consistency that it barely qualifies as a contest? If you find this kind of question worth following all the way to its real answer, and not just the surface answer that satisfies casual curiosity, but the deep answer that involves evolutionary biology and ecological history and the specific mechanics of how two apex predators interact across multiple food sources, multiple seasons, and multiple decades of documented observation, then stay with this. Subscribe if you want to keep getting content that treats these animals with the seriousness they deserve. The answer to who wins is not complicated. The grizzly wins. It wins consistently, dramatically, and with such reliability across documented encounters that researchers studying bear competition have noted the asymmetry as one of the most lopsided interspecific competitive relationships in North American megafauna. A mature male grizzly bear in Yellowstone can weigh between 400 and 700 pounds. A mature male black bear in the same ecosystem, at the same time of year, at the same stage of hypophagia, will weigh between 200 and 400 pounds. The largest black bears documented in the scientific literature top out at weights that represent the low to middle range of an average grizzly. The size differential is meaningful. It translates directly into force production, into bite strength, into the ability to absorb and deliver physical punishment during a confrontation. But the answer of who wins, while simple, rests on a foundation that is anything but. Understanding why the grizzly wins every time requires understanding the full biological architecture of each species, the food sources they compete for, the behavioral strategies each has developed over evolutionary time, and the ecological consequences of a competitive relationship, this one-sided playing out across a landscape where both species are simultaneously trying to survive. Start with what the animals are, not in the casual sense, but in the precise biological sense that determines everything else. Ursus arctos horribilis, the grizzly bear, is a subspecies of the brown bear that colonized North America from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge, arriving on this continent sometime between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. It brought with it the evolutionary toolkit of a brown bear lineage that had spent millions of years in competition with other large Eurasian carnivores, including wolves, cave lions, hyenas, and other bear species. The grizzly is not simply a large black bear. It is a fundamentally different ecological entity that evolved in a different predator guild, developed different competitive strategies, and carries a different set of physical and behavioral adaptations that reflect a history of living in a world full of things that could contest it. The shoulder hump that distinguishes a grizzly from a black bear at a distance is not decoration. It is a mass of muscle that powers the forelimb strike, used both in excavating prey from dens and root systems and in physical combat. The grizzly's claws are longer and less curved than a black bear's, adapted for digging rather than climbing, and they are weapons of excavation that double, when necessary, as weapons of assault. The grizzly's skull is domed, its facial profile dished, its jaw muscles enormous. It can bite through the femur of an elk. It can dig a ground squirrel out of bedrock substrate if the motivation is sufficient. It is built for a life that involves overcoming physical resistance, whether from the earth or from other animals. Ursus americanus, the American black bear, is a different story. It is the older resident. The black bear lineage has been in North America for approximately 2 million years. It evolved here, in a North America that contained multiple bear species and a much larger suite of megafauna predators than exists today, including the short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, which was substantially larger than any living bear and which likely imposed significant selective pressure on black bear behavior and ecology. The black bear is not a diminished grizzly. It is a highly successful generalist that has survived every extinction event that has reshaped North American megafauna over 2 million years by being flexible, cryptic, and extremely good at avoiding costly confrontations. Its shorter claws are climbing adaptations. Its less prominent shoulder hump reflects less investment in the excavation musculature. Its behavioral tendency toward wariness and rapid retreat from confrontation is not cowardice in any meaningful sense of the word. It is the product of 2 million years of natural selection in a landscape where picking fights with larger predators was a reliable way to exit the gene pool. The black bear's survival strategy across its evolutionary history has been to exploit food sources that larger competitors are not currently using, to detect and avoid confrontation before it becomes physical, and to retreat rapidly into terrain, specifically trees and dense cover, where its climbing ability provides an escape route unavailable to heavier, less agile competitors. This is the biological context in which the competition plays out. Two species shaped by entirely different evolutionary histories, carrying entirely different toolkits, occupying what ecologists call the same trophic level with substantial overlap in dietary requirements. And the overlap is extensive. The degree to which grizzly bears and black bears want the same things, at the same times, in the same places, is the foundation of the competitive relationship and the reason it matters as much as it does. Both species are omnivores, with diets that shift dramatically across seasons. In spring, when they emerge from their dens after months of torpor, both species are in caloric deficit and both orient heavily toward easily digestible, high-carbohydrate and high-protein food sources. Green vegetation, particularly the new growth of sedges, grasses, and forbs in riparian areas and meadows, is an important early-season food for both. Carrion, the winter-killed ungulates that have not survived the season, is critically important to both. This is the first point of direct competition, and it is the one that has been studied most intensively in Yellowstone, where the density of both species and the density of winter-killed bison and elk create repeated, documented encounters over carcasses that reveal the competitive hierarchy in direct, unambiguous terms. When a grizzly and a black bear arrive at the same carcass, the outcome is not in question. The grizzly takes the carcass. The black bear leaves. The only variability in this outcome involves the size and age of the animals involved. And even at the extremes of that variability, the direction of the outcome rarely changes. A large adult male black bear confronting a subadult female grizzly of similar mass might hold its ground briefly. But the behavioral literature on interspecific bear competition at carcasses in Yellowstone and in the Canadian Rockies documents grizzly dominance with a consistency that approaches universality. The grizzly does not always have to physically expel the black bear. In many documented cases, the black bear withdraws before any physical contact occurs, responding to the grizzly's approach, posture, and vocalizations with the same informed retreat captured in the trail camera footage from the pine stand. The black bear's nervous system is not processing the situation incorrectly. It is processing it with complete accuracy and responding with the behavior that millions of years of evolutionary conditioning has identified as optimal in this specific situation. The carcass competition is economically significant in a way that is easy to understate. In early spring in Yellowstone, a grizzly bear emerging from 6 months of torpor needs enormous caloric intake to recover its body condition, fuel normal physiological function, and begin the reproductive cycle if it is a female. The window during which winter-killed ungulates are available as high-quality food sources is relatively short. Carcasses decompose, scavenging competitors, including ravens, wolves, coyotes, eagles, and other bears, reduce the available biomass on any given carcass quickly. A grizzly that is consistently able to displace black bears from carcasses across that window is gaining a competitive foraging advantage that compounds across time. A black bear that is consistently displaced from carcasses by grizzlies is losing access to one of the most calorie-dense food sources available in its environment during the period when it most needs calories. The competitive asymmetry at carcasses is not just a social dynamic. It is a direct transfer of nutritional resources from one species to the other. The summer food matrix is where the competition becomes more diffuse and, for that reason, more interesting to examine in detail. Both species consume enormous quantities of berries during summer and early fall, and the overlap in berry species selection between grizzlies and black bears is extensive. Huckleberries, serviceberries, buffalo berries, chokecherries, and several species of currants are consumed heavily by both species across their shared range, and the timing of peak consumption overlaps substantially. The competitive dynamic at berry patches differs from the dynamic at carcasses in an important way. A carcass is a point resource. There is one of it. The competitive interaction over it is zero-sum in a direct and immediate sense. A berry patch is a distributed resource. It extends across a hillside, a drainage, a stand of shrubs. A berry-feeding grizzly and a berry-feeding black bear do not necessarily have to occupy the same square meter of terrain at the same moment. The question of whether their competition over berry patches is primarily direct, through aggressive displacement, or primarily indirect, through resource depletion, is one that researchers have examined with close attention because the answer has implications for how the competitive relationship affects black bear population dynamics. The evidence from multiple study systems suggests that both mechanisms operate, with their relative importance varying by habitat configuration and bear density. In areas where berry patches are dense and extensive relative to bear density, black bears and grizzlies often use the same patches without direct encounters, with temporal and microhabitat partitioning reducing the frequency of competitive interactions. In areas where berry patches are sparse relative to the combined demand of both species, direct competitive displacement becomes more common and more consequential. The grizzly, when it encounters a black bear in a productive berry patch, displaces it. This is documented. The question of what happens to the black bear after displacement depends on whether alternative berry resources are available within its home range. If they are, the displacement is a cost, not a catastrophe. If they are not, the displacement during peak hypophagia, the period of intense feeding before hibernation, during which bears must accumulate the fat reserves that will sustain them through winter, represents a serious threat to the individual black bear's survival probability. Hypophagia deserves particular attention because it is the season during which the competition between grizzlies and black bears is most consequential, and during which the behavioral dynamics between them are most intensely studied. Hypophagia is the physiological state preceding hibernation, in which bears' caloric intake and foraging effort increase dramatically. A bear in hypophagia can consume 20,000 calories per day. The food sources that fuel hypophagia vary by region, and in many of the ecosystems where grizzlies and black bears co-occur, they converge on the same handful of food sources with a focus that makes competition intense and direct. In the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, whitebark pine seeds have historically been the premier hypophagia food source for grizzlies. The nuts are extraordinarily calorie-dense, high in fat and protein, and available in large quantities in productive years. Black bears also consume whitebark pine nuts. Squirrel middens, the caches of cones and seeds created by red squirrels, are raided by both species with nearly identical techniques. The difference is what happens when both species want the same midden at the same time. The grizzly takes it. The whitebark pine story is worth following in detail because it illustrates something important about how the competitive relationship between grizzly bears and black bears interacts with ecological change in ways that produce unpredictable outcomes. Whitebark pine forests across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem have been experiencing catastrophic mortality from a combination of white pine blister rust, an introduced fungal pathogen, and mountain pine beetle outbreaks that have been expanding in range and severity as temperatures warm. The area of productive whitebark pine forest available to bears in Yellowstone has declined substantially over the past 3 decades and continues to decline. In years when whitebark pine cone production is poor or when accessible stands are limited, grizzly bears shift their hypophagia foraging to alternative food sources. Those alternative sources include army cutworm moths at high-elevation talus fields, cutthroat trout in spawning streams, and ungulate carcasses. They also include berry fields, root systems, and the full range of foods that black bears are simultaneously trying to exploit. The decline of whitebark pine as a premium food source for grizzlies does not reduce grizzly competition with black bears. It increases it by pushing grizzlies into deeper reliance on the food sources that constitute the core of the black bear's diet across all seasons. The cutthroat trout competition is one of the most visually dramatic manifestations of the competitive hierarchy between the two species, and the one that has been most extensively documented through direct observation. In streams where cutthroat trout or other salmonids run in accessible numbers, both grizzlies and black bears fish. Grizzlies are more dedicated fishers in most contexts, with individual grizzlies in productive salmon systems consuming hundreds of fish over the course of a run. Black bears fish as well, but their access to fishing locations in systems where grizzlies are present is significantly constrained by competitive displacement. At prime fishing spots, riffles and falls where fish concentrate and are easily caught, grizzlies occupy the position and black bears wait, if they are present at all. Direct observations from multiple salmon systems in Alaska and British Columbia document black bears fishing secondary locations, shallow margins, and less productive stream segments, while grizzlies work the prime stations. The spatial segregation is not absolute, and smaller black bears sometimes fish in proximity to grizzlies without direct confrontation, when the grizzly is focused on fishing rather than social interaction. But the prime fishing locations, the spots that produce the highest catch rates and therefore the most efficient caloric return, belong to grizzlies when both species are present. The Alaska situation is the most extreme version of this dynamic because it involves grizzlies, or coastal brown bears as they are often called in that context, in the highest densities found anywhere on the continent, and because the salmon resource driving the competition is so nutritionally valuable that the competitive stakes are correspondingly high. A large male brown bear at the peak of a salmon run can consume 100 pounds of fish in a day. The caloric density of salmon, particularly the fat-rich flesh of late-run silver and king salmon, is extraordinary. Bears that feed heavily on salmon during the run enter winter with fat reserves that substantially exceed those of bears that did not have access to good fishing locations. The difference in body condition between bears that hold prime fishing spots through the salmon run and bears that are displaced from those spots is measurable in their winter survival probability and, for females, in their reproductive success. The black bear's position in this competition is not good. In systems with significant grizzly or brown bear density, black bears access salmon opportunistically at the margins of the competition, taking what is available when and where the larger species is not actively excluding them. The den site competition represents a dimension of the relationship that receives less attention than the food competition, but that has documented consequences for black bear survival in areas where grizzly density is high. Both species excavate dens in hillsides, root systems, and rocky outcrops, and the characteristics of a good den site: south-facing aspect for snow accumulation and insulation, slope angle sufficient for snow loading, substrate accessible to excavation, overlap substantially between the two species. Grizzlies have been documented taking over black bear dens. The mechanism is straightforward. A grizzly discovers an occupied den, the black bear leaves, the grizzly takes the site. This is not a common event in the documented record, but it occurs, and it represents the most direct possible expression of the competitive asymmetry. The resource in question is the den that will determine whether an animal survives the winter. The outcome is determined by the same size and behavioral hierarchy that determines every other competitive interaction between the two species. It is worth pausing here to address a question that arises in any serious discussion of grizzly black bear competition, which is whether the competitive asymmetry is really as absolute as the evidence suggests, or whether there are conditions under which it breaks down. The answer is nuanced, in a way that does not change the fundamental conclusion, but that matters for a complete understanding of the relationship. There are conditions under which individual black bears hold their ground against individual grizzlies. A female black bear with cubs at a food source has been documented in multiple instances standing her ground against approaching grizzlies rather than withdrawing. The maternal defense motivation is real and powerful, and it occasionally produces outcomes in which the grizzly redirects rather than forces the confrontation. Large, old, dominant male black bears in systems with low grizzly density occasionally occupy food resources in ways that suggest genuine competitive confidence rather than the calculated deference of a smaller animal in the presence of a larger one. Subadult grizzlies, bears that are large enough to dominate black bears in principle, but young enough to lack the social confidence of established adult males, are occasionally displaced from food sources by adult black bears in documented observations. These exceptions are real. They do not alter the pattern. The pattern is dominance by grizzlies across food competition at every scale and in every food category where both species have been studied systematically. The exceptions represent the noise in a signal that is otherwise remarkably consistent. What they tell you is that the competitive relationship is behavioral as well as physical, that size advantage must be translated through behavioral assertion to produce competitive outcomes, and that individual variation in behavioral assertiveness within each species creates a distribution of outcomes around the central tendency of grizzly dominance, rather than a perfectly deterministic rule. But the central tendency is not in question. The grizzly wins. It wins at carcasses and fishing spots and berry patches and pine nut middens. It wins in spring and summer and fall. It wins with mature males and with females, and sometimes with subadults. It wins with the consistency of a weight class advantage that is large enough to be decisive across the full range of natural variation in individual animals. The behavioral mechanisms through which grizzly dominance is expressed are worth examining in detail because they reveal something important about how the competitive relationship functions at the level of individual animal decision-making. The grizzly does not win simply by being larger. It wins through a behavioral system that communicates its dominance before physical contact occurs, that allows the outcome to be determined at the level of display and approach rather than actual combat, and that both species have evolved to navigate efficiently. A grizzly approaching a black bear at a food source does so with a specific postural and movement signature that communicates threat in ways the black bear reads accurately and responds to appropriately. The piloerection, the raised hackles along the shoulder and back, is a size-amplifying display that makes the grizzly look larger than it is. The stiff-legged approach, the direct orientation toward the black bear rather than the food source, the slow, deliberate pace that communicates confidence rather than urgency, all of these are elements of a threat display system that the black bear has been selected to recognize and respond to. The black bear's response, withdrawal before contact, is not failure. It is the adaptive behavior of an animal that has correctly assessed the situation and chosen the course of action that minimizes the probability of injury. The cost-benefit calculation driving the black bear's withdrawal is real and has been modeled formally by researchers studying interspecific competition in bears. The black bear that does not withdraw from a grizzly approaching a food source is a black bear that risks serious injury or death in a physical confrontation it is very likely to lose. The food that it is contesting, whether berries, fish, or pine nuts, has a calculable caloric value. The probability of injury in a physical confrontation with a grizzly and the long-term fitness cost of that injury can be estimated from the documented record of interspecific encounters. When those numbers are placed alongside each other, the calculation almost always favors withdrawal. The food is not worth the injury risk. The black bear's nervous system has been calibrated by natural selection to reach this conclusion quickly and act on it before the grizzly closes to contact range. This is why the 40-second hesitation in the trail camera footage before the black bear's retreat is behaviorally significant. That hesitation is not indecision. It is assessment. The black bear was reading the grizzly, calculating the situation, and confirming what it already knew before taking the most efficient path to an outcome that preserved its physical integrity. The geographic context of the competition matters enormously and shapes the intensity and consequences of the interaction in ways that are not always appreciated in general discussions of bear behavior. In the core of the grizzly's current range, which includes the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem in Montana, and the wilderness areas of British Columbia and Alberta, the competitive relationship plays out in terrain where both species have historically co-occurred and where the black bear population has been shaped by centuries of competition with grizzlies. Black bears in these systems show distinct behavioral adaptations to grizzly presence that are not shared by black bears in systems without grizzlies. They are more arboreal in their escape behavior. They use den sites in terrain configurations that are less accessible to grizzlies. They show patterns of temporal and spatial food use that reflect active avoidance of areas where grizzly density is highest. These adaptations are not accidental. They are the product of long-term natural selection in a system where failing to avoid grizzlies had real fitness consequences. In the peripheral zones where grizzly range is expanding, the competitive dynamic plays out against a different behavioral background. Black bears in areas that have not had grizzlies present for historical time, whether because grizzly populations were extirpated in the 19th and 20th centuries or because the bear is expanding into new territory, have not been shaped by the same selective pressure. They are less behaviorally calibrated to grizzly presence. Their immediate response to the threat signals that a grizzly projects may be less precisely tuned. The competitive outcomes are the same. The size and weaponry differential that determines the competitive hierarchy does not change based on the black bear's evolutionary familiarity with the threat. But the transition period, as black bears in newly occupied areas recalibrate their behavioral responses to the presence of a dominant competitor they have not encountered before, is ecologically interesting and potentially consequential for the local black bear population. The grizzly recovery story in the lower 48 states is relevant here because it is active and ongoing, and because its trajectory will determine the geographic scope and intensity of grizzly black bear competition across an expanding front. The greater Yellowstone grizzly population, federally listed as threatened in 1975 with approximately 150 bears remaining, has recovered to over 700 animals, and has expanded its range substantially beyond the boundaries of the park itself. The Northern Continental Divide population, centered on Glacier National Park, has been similarly successful. Recovery plans being evaluated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service contemplate reintroduction of grizzlies to the Bitterroot ecosystem in central Idaho, the North Cascades in Washington, and potentially other areas within the species' historical range. Each of these areas contains significant black bear populations. Each reintroduction would initiate the competitive dynamics discussed above in ecosystems where they have been absent for generations. The wildlife management and ecological implications of this expansion, both the natural expansion of existing populations and the potential reintroductions, include a significant chapter on what happens to black bears when grizzlies arrive in their territory. The evidence from systems where this has already happened is not reassuring for black bears. Studies of black bear population dynamics in areas of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem where grizzly density has increased over the past 3 decades have documented decreased black bear density in high grizzly density areas over the same period. The relationship is not perfectly clean. Black bear populations are influenced by many variables besides grizzly competition, including habitat quality, hunting pressure, human conflict mortality, and prey availability. But the correlation between areas of high grizzly density and areas of declining or suppressed black bear density is consistent enough across multiple study sites to suggest a genuine competitive effect at the population level. The grizzly's expansion within Yellowstone is, among other things, a displacement event for black bears, one that is playing out slowly enough and across a large enough spatial scale that it does not register in the public consciousness the way a dramatic predation event would, but that is ecologically real and ecologically consequential. The mechanism of population-level displacement is not mass killing of black bears by grizzlies. Direct grizzly predation on black bears occurs and is documented, but it is not common enough to be the primary driver of population-level effects. The mechanism is more subtle and more diffuse. It operates through the competitive exclusion of black bears from the best food resources in the landscape. Bears that are consistently displaced from high-quality food sources during the critical hypophagia period enter winter with reduced fat reserves. Bears with reduced fat reserves are more likely to die during winter, more likely to produce fewer or no cubs, more likely to have cubs that do not survive their first winter. The population-level effect of consistent competitive disadvantage accumulates across time through these reproductive and survival mechanisms rather than through direct predation. It is the slow pressure of being second in every competition that matters, applied across every season, every food source, every productive patch of habitat, in an area where a competitor of superior competitive ability is present. The cub predation dimension of the grizzly-black bear relationship deserves explicit treatment because it represents the most direct form of competitive interaction between the species and the one with the most immediate population-level consequences. Grizzly bears are documented predators of black bear cubs in multiple study systems. The behavior has been recorded through both direct observation and the analysis of grizzly predation sites where black bear cub remains were found. The frequency of cub predation by grizzlies is difficult to estimate precisely because it is a cryptic behavior that leaves limited evidence. But the multiple lines of evidence pointing to its occurrence in areas of grizzly-black bear overlap are consistent. The ecological logic of cub predation is not difficult to understand. Black bear cubs represent a protein source of appropriate size for a large omnivore with opportunistic predatory tendencies. Female grizzlies, with their own cubs to feed, have a particularly clear incentive to eliminate potential future competitors for food resources. And the small size and limited defensive capability of black bear cubs makes them vulnerable in a way that adult black bears are not. Female black bears in areas of high grizzly density show behavioral responses to this threat that include increased arboreal behavior for cubs, selection of home range areas with dense cover and abundant climbing trees, and elevated vigilance near food sources where grizzly encounter probability is high. The question of how black bears have managed to persist in ecosystems with grizzlies for the thousands of years during which the two species co-occurred before European settlement is important because it provides the ecological baseline against which current conditions can be evaluated. The answer involves a combination of habitat partitioning, behavioral avoidance, and the simple spatial reality that in a large, intact ecosystem with abundant food resources, the overlap between species at specific resource patches at specific times is lower than it might appear from a description of their diets. Pre-settlement North America was not a landscape of scarcity. It was a landscape of extraordinary biological richness, with ungulate densities that current conditions in most of the lower 48 states do not approach, with salmon runs that turned rivers silver, with berry patches and mast crops across ranges that have since been reduced and fragmented. In that context, the competitive pressure between grizzlies and black bears was real, but it operated in a landscape where the resource base was large enough that both species could meet their nutritional requirements, even with significant competitive losses. A black bear that loses a berry patch to a grizzly in a landscape with abundant berry patches distributed across a large home range has lost a battle without losing the war. The situation in the modern American West is different in ways that matter for how the competitive relationship plays out. The landscape is fragmented. Home ranges are not intact across the spatial scales at which bears naturally operate. Food resources are not distributed across the full historical range of the species. Human land use has compressed both species into habitat islands and habitat corridors that are smaller and more isolated than the landscapes in which their competitive relationship evolved. In this compressed landscape, the competitive advantage held by grizzlies over black bears is amplified because the black bear's primary adaptive response to grizzly competition, moving away from areas of high grizzly density and exploiting the food resources of the areas grizzlies are not using, is constrained by the landscape matrix in ways it was not historically. A black bear that cannot move 30 miles to the west to avoid grizzly competition because there is a developed valley blocking the route is a black bear that must absorb the full competitive pressure of a dominant competitor in a food resource base that may not be large enough to accommodate both species at their current densities. The fishing situation in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska represents the most extreme and the most intensively studied version of the resource competition between the two species, and it is worth examining in detail because the economic stakes of the competition at salmon streams are so high that they illuminate the competitive hierarchy with unusual clarity. In coastal Alaska and British Columbia, brown bears and black bears both access salmon during the annual runs, but the competitive dynamic at prime fishing sites is almost perfectly described by the dominance hierarchy. Large male brown bears hold the best fishing stations. Smaller brown bears hold secondary stations. Black bears, if they are present at all, fish the margins. The economics of this arrangement are visible in the body condition data. Bears with access to high-quality fishing stations enter hypophagia with larger fat reserves. Bears with larger fat reserves produce more cubs and survive the winter at higher rates. The competitive hierarchy at salmon streams is directly translated into differential reproductive success between the species, and the differential runs in one direction. What makes the salmon competition particularly instructive is that it is one of the few contexts where the absolute size of the resource is large enough that exclusion of black bears from prime sites does not necessarily prevent black bears from accessing the resource at all. Salmon runs, at their peak, deliver fish across enough of a stream system that black bears can fish productive, if not optimal locations, and accumulate meaningful caloric intake. In this sense, the salmon competition is a milder version of the competitive exclusion than the Carcass competition or the pine nut competition, where the resource is more spatially concentrated and the difference between access and no access is more absolute. But milder does not mean absent. Black bears that fish secondary locations during salmon runs are still underperforming relative to their potential in a grizzly-free system. And that underperformance is part of the cumulative competitive disadvantage that shapes black bear population dynamics in areas of grizzly overlap. The behavioral ecology of the food competition between grizzlies and black bears includes one dimension that is particularly interesting from the perspective of understanding how the relationship functions at a mechanistic level, which is the role of olfaction and information gathering in the competitive dynamic. Both species have olfactory capabilities that are among the most powerful in the mammalian world. A bear's nose is estimated to be 7 times more sensitive than a bloodhound's, which is itself dramatically more sensitive than a human's. In the context of interspecific competition, this means that both grizzlies and black bears are gathering information about each other's presence, location, and activity through scent at ranges and with precision that are difficult for humans to appreciate. A black bear moving through its home range is continuously sampling olfactory information about grizzly presence from the environment, from scat, from scent marks on trees, from the directional drift of scent on air currents that can carry bear odor across distances of miles in favorable conditions. This olfactory information is being used to make real-time decisions about where to forage and where to avoid. Researchers studying black bear movement patterns in areas of grizzly overlap have found that black bears avoid areas of recent grizzly activity, indexed by fresh scent marks and tracks, even when those areas contain productive food resources. The avoidance is not absolute and breaks down when food scarcity overrides caution, but under normal conditions, it represents an active, information-based resource partitioning strategy that reduces competitive encounter frequency. The black bear is not simply reacting to grizzlies when it encounters them. It is actively using environmental information to structure its foraging activity in ways that minimize the probability of encounter. This is sophisticated behavioral ecology, and it is one of the mechanisms through which black bears maintain viable population densities in areas where grizzlies are present despite the severity of the competitive disadvantage when encounters do occur. The temporal dimension of the competition deserves specific attention because the seasonal timing of food resource availability shapes both the intensity of competition and the consequences of competitive loss in ways that are not uniform across the year. In early spring, when both species emerge from dens in nutritional deficit, the competition over carrion and early green vegetation is intense, but the consequences of competitive loss, being displaced from a particular carcass or vegetation patch, are moderated by the relative abundance of those resources across the landscape in a productive spring. The metabolic urgency of hypophagia in late summer and early fall creates a different situation. During hypophagia, the window during which bears must accumulate the fat reserves that will determine their winter survival probability. Competitive displacement from high-quality food sources has consequences that extend forward in time through the winter and into the reproductive season. A female black bear that enters hibernation with insufficient fat reserves due to competitive displacement from prime berry patches or fishing locations may fail to produce cubs, may produce cubs she cannot sustain, or may herself fail to survive the winter. The late-season competition is the most consequential, and it is the season during which the direct competitive interactions between grizzlies and black bears, as both species press hard on high-quality food sources with the focused intensity of animals under physiological pressure, are most frequent and most consequential. The spatial ecology of the competition, the question of how the two species partition the landscape in response to the competitive hierarchy, has been studied through GPS collar data in several systems and produces results that are consistent across study areas. In areas where both species are collared and tracked simultaneously, black bear home ranges show systematic deviations from expected distributions that reflect avoidance of areas of high grizzly use. The core areas of grizzly activity, the areas where high-quality food sources are concentrated and where grizzly use intensity is highest, are underrepresented in black bear home range space relative to what would be expected based on food availability alone. The black bears are not randomly distributed across the landscape. They are distributed in ways that reflect active avoidance of the portions of the landscape where competitive encounter probability is highest. This spatial segregation has a cost. The areas of high grizzly use are typically the areas of highest food resource quality. They are the prime berry patches, the best fishing locations, the most productive whitebark pine stands. The black bears are not avoiding the bad parts of the landscape. They are avoiding the best parts. The landscape they are left with, after grizzly avoidance is accounted for, is a landscape of secondary food quality distributed in terrain and forest types where grizzly density is lower. In a rich landscape, this is a viable existence. In a constrained or fragmented landscape, it may not be. The question of whether the competitive relationship between grizzlies and black bears has meaningful conservation implications for black bear populations in areas of current and expanding grizzly range is one that wildlife managers have been slow to address directly, partly because black bears are generally considered secure from a conservation standpoint, with large and widely distributed populations across North America, and partly because the management priority in most of the systems where the competition occurs is the grizzly, not the black bear. The grizzly is listed, recovering, and the subject of intensive conservation attention. The black bear is abundant, unlisted, and managed primarily as a game species. The competitive consequences of grizzly recovery for black bear populations are not a prominent concern in most management frameworks. This is understandable. Black bear populations across North America are not in trouble at the continental scale, but the local and regional population dynamics that grizzly expansion is producing deserve attention that they are not currently receiving, particularly in the areas of the West where grizzly recovery is most advanced and where the competitive pressure on black bears is most intense. The research record on this question is thinner than it should be, partly because of the management priority differential mentioned above, and partly because the long time scales over which competitive effects accumulate in large mammal populations make them difficult to study within normal research funding cycles. The clearest signal in the existing data is the pattern of suppressed or declining black bear density in areas of high grizzly density within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. A pattern documented across multiple study areas with enough consistency to be taken seriously as a competitive effect rather than a coincidence of habitat variables. What the data does not yet support is a detailed mechanistic model of the pathways through which competitive pressure translates into population effects. And building that model requires the kind of long-term, simultaneous multi-species monitoring that is expensive and rarely funded. The studies that have been done suggest the effect is real. The studies needed to characterize it fully have not been done. The predation dimension of the relationship, as distinct from the resource competition, is worth a separate and sustained examination because it is less well known than the competition, and because it adds a layer of direct mortality to the competitive disadvantage that black bears experience in the presence of grizzlies. Grizzly predation on black bears is documented. It is not common in the sense of occurring daily or weekly in any study system, but it occurs with enough frequency and consistency across documented cases to be treated as a genuine biological interaction rather than an occasional aberration. Adult grizzly bears, particularly large males, have been documented killing adult black bears in several study systems. The killing is not always associated with food consumption, though consumption of killed black bears has been documented. Some of the killings appear to be associated with competition over resources at specific locations. Others appear to be expressions of dominance behavior that extends to lethal outcomes in some cases. The killing of black bears by grizzlies does not appear to be a primary predatory strategy in any studied system. Grizzlies are not hunting black bears as a significant component of their diet in the way that they might hunt ground squirrels or fish or ungulates. What the documented killings represent is the most extreme outcome of a competitive relationship in which the size and capability differential is large enough that lethal force is occasionally applied, and the outcome is not in question. A grizzly that decides to escalate a competitive interaction to physical combat has the capability to kill a black bear, and in documented cases, it does. The behavioral system of threat display and avoidance that normally prevents this outcome